Section 22 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marc Roche. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5, by Henry Gray. Chapter 2H. The Large Intestine. Intestinum crassum. The sigmoid colon sigmoideum, pelvic colon, sigmoid flexure, forms a loop which averages about 40 centimeters in length and normally lies within the pelvis, but on account of its freedom of movement is liable to be displaced into the abdominal cavity. It begins at the superior aperture of the lesser pelvis, where it is continuous with the iliac colon, and passes transversely across the front of the sacrum to the right side of the pelvis. It then curves on itself and turns toward the left to reach the middle line at the level of the third piece of the sacrum, where it bends downward and ends in the rectum. It is completely surrounded by peritoneum, which forms a mesentery, sigmoid mesocolon, which diminishes in length from the center toward the ends of the loop, where it disappears so that the loop is fixed at its junctions with the iliac colon and rectum, but enjoys a considerable range of movement in its central portion. Behind the sigmoid colon are the external iliac vessels, the left piriformis and left sacral plexus of nerves. In front, it is separated from the bladder in the male and the uterus in the female by some coils of the small intestine. The rectum, intestinum rectum, is continuous above with the sigmoid colon, while below it ends in the anal canal. From its origin at the level of the third sacral vertebra, it passes downward, lying in the sacrococcygeal curve, and extends for about 2.5 centimeters in front of and a little below the tip of the coccyx, as far as the apex of the prostate. It then bends sharply backward into the anal canal. It therefore presents two antero-posterior curves, an upper with its convexity backwards, and the lower with its convexity forward. Two lateral curves are also described, one to the right opposite the junction of the third and fourth sacral vertebra, and the other to the left, opposite the left sacrococcygeal articulation. They are, however, of little importance. The rectum is about 12 centimeters long, and at its commencement its caliber is similar to that of the sigmoid colon, but near its termination it is dilated to form the rectal ampulla. The rectum has no saculations comparable to those of the colon, but when the lower part of the rectum is contracted, its mucous membrane is thrown into a number of folds, which are longitudinal in direction, and are effaced by the distension of the gut. Besides these, there are certain permanent transverse folds of a semilunar shape, known as Houston's valves. They are usually 3 in number, sometimes a fourth is found, and occasionally only 2 are present. One is situated near the commencement of the rectum, on the right side. A second extends inward from the left side of the tube, opposite the middle of the sacrum. A third, the largest and most constant, projects backward from the forepart of the rectum, opposite the fundus of the urinary bladder. When a fourth is present, it is situated nearly 2.5 centimeters above the anus on the left and posterior wall of the tube. These folds are about 12 millimeters in width, and contain some of the circular fibers of the gut. In the empty state of the intestine they overlap each other, as Houston remarks, so as effectually as to require considerable maneuvering to conduct a bougie or the finger along the canal. Their use seems to be to support the weight of fecal matter and prevent its urging toward the anus, where its presence always excites a sensation of demanding its discharge. Footnote. Patterson, The Form of the Rectum, Journal of Anatomy and Physiology, Volume 43, utilizes the third fold for the purpose of dividing the rectum into an upper and lower portion. He considers the latter to be just as much a duct as the narrower anal canal below, and maintains that under normal conditions it does not contain feces except during the act of defecation. End footnote. The peritoneum is related to the upper 2/3 of the rectum, covering at first its front and sides, but lower down its front only. From the latter it is reflected onto the seminal vesicles in the male and the posterior vaginal wall in the female. The level at which the peritoneum leaves the anterior wall of the rectum to be reflected onto the viscus in front of it is of considerable importance from a surgical point of view, in connection with the removal of the lower part of the rectum. It is higher in the male than in the female. In the former, the height of the rectovesical excavation is about 7.5 centimeters, i.e., the height to which an ordinary index finger can reach from the anus. In the female, the height of the rectouterine excavation is about 5.5 centimeters from the anal orifice. The rectum is surrounded by a dense tube of fascia derived from the fascia endopelvina, but fused behind with the fascia covering the sacrum and coccyx. The fascial tube is loosely attached to the rectal wall by areolar tissue in order to allow the distension of the viscus. Relations of the rectum. The upper part of the rectum is in relation behind with the superior hemorrhoidal vessels, the left piriformis, and left sacral plexus of nerves, which separate it from the pelvic surfaces of the sacral vertebra. In its lower part, it lies directly on the sacrum, coccyx, and levatorius ani, a dense fascia alone intervening. In front, it is separated above, in the male, from the fundus of the bladder, in the female from the intestinal surface of the uterus and its appendages by some convolutions of the small intestine, and frequently by the sigmoid colon. Below, it is in relation in the male with the triangular portion of the fundus of the bladder, the vesiculae seminales and ductus deferentes, and more anteriorly with the posterior surface of the prostate. In the female, with the posterior wall of the vagina. The anal canal, pars analis recti, or terminal portion of the large intestine, begins at the level of the apex of the prostate, is directed downward and backward, and ends at the anus. It forms an angle with the lower part of the rectum, and measures from 2.5 to 4 centimeters in length. It has no peritoneal covering, but is invested by the sphincter ani internus, supported by the levatorius ani, and surrounded at its termination by the sphincter ani externus. In the empty condition it presents the appearance of an anterio-posterior longitudinal slit. Behind it is a mass of muscular and fibrous tissue, the anococcygeal body, Symington. In front of it, in the male, but separated by connective tissue from it, are the membranous portion and bulb of the urethra, and the fascia of the urogenital diaphragm. And in the female, it is separated from the lower end of the vagina by a mass of muscular and fibrous tissue, named the perineal body. The lumen of the anal canal presents, in its upper half, a number of vertical folds, produced by an infolding of the mucous membrane and some of the muscular tissue. They are known as the rectal columns, Morgagni, and are separated from one another by furrows, rectal sinuses, which end below in small valve-like folds termed anal valves, which join together the lower ends of the rectal columns. Structure of the colon. The large intestine has 4 coats: serous, muscular, areolar, and mucous. The serous coat, tunica serosa, is derived from the peritoneum, and invests the different portions of the large intestine to a variable extent. The cecum is completely covered by the serous membrane, except in about 5% of cases where the upper part of the posterior surface is uncovered. The ascending, descending, and iliac parts of the colon are usually covered only in front and at the sides. A variable amount of the posterior surface is uncovered. The transverse colon is almost completely invested, the parts corresponding to the attachment of the greater omentum and transverse mesocolon being alone excepted. The sigmoid colon is entirely surrounded. The rectum is covered above on its anterior surface and sides, below on its anterior aspect only. The anal canal is entirely devoid of any serous covering. In the course of the colon, the peritoneal coat is thrown into a number of small pouches filled with fat, called appendices epiploici. They are most numerous on the transverse colon. The muscular coat, tunica muscularis, consists of an external longitudinal and an internal circular layer of non-striped muscular fibers. The longitudinal fibers do not form a continuous layer over the whole surface of the large intestine.